Hi, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depends where in the world you are joining us from today. Welcome back to Azure Lowlands in the Netherlands. My name is Isidora, and I'm sitting here today with my lovely co-hostess Floor, who's going to introduce our next panelist of today, where we're going to talk about moving to Azure. So very excited. Let's get going.
Yeah, absolutely. Very happy that you could join us. Some of you just straight out of your session as well. I'm going to introduce you. Starting with you, Callum. You're a .NET developer at Bum Digital, Microsoft MVP, co-host of the YouTube series Umbra Coffee.
Yeah, that's right.
Hi, that's you.
Hello.
And you had an earlier session. Can you tell us about what it was about?
Well, I think
because we didn't stream that.
Of course.
This one. Yeah.
I think we're going to get into some of the topics we discussed actually, because it was all about taking a kind of starter .NET app and upgrading it and making it work with Azure and scaling that through the different services and the ways you could do that, containers and Kubernetes, and it got all quite fun. So.
Okay, cool. Then I'm excited to hear more about that. And then on your to your right is Rick, who is a chief consulting off. Wait, no, sorry.
First, Alex.
I messed it up. You first, Alex.
Oh, okay.
You're a cloud architect at Xspirit and an MVP for developer technologies. Hi, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having us.
So happy that you could join us. Have you visited Callum's session so that you can talk about the...
No,
you did not.
No,
oh gosh.
I did not.
Let's move on real quickly.
We will catch up, and I think
I'm
we're in the
pretty
same
sure,
space of,
yeah.
of development for the cloud, so it should be good. I think we're aligned. Yeah.
That should be fine. Awesome. Please pass the microphone to Rick.
Yeah, so
Hi,
it's
Rick.
the grey hair,
I'm
isn't
so
it? You
sorry.
can't tell us
I
apart, right?
love the bow tie. Loving your bow tie, Rick.
I think the bow tie got me all confused, maybe. I'm so excited about it. Hey, so you are the Chief Consulting Officer at Black Marble, and you're also a Microsoft MVP and a Regional Director as well.
I am.
Welcome.
Yep, for my sins. And I too have done a session, and I was talking about migrating an app to the cloud, so I'm thinking that's probably a good topic for this discussion, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get it started as well. Migrating an app to the cloud, is that just lift and shift and everybody can do it, or is it a little bit more difficult than that?
So remember you told me what I should never ever say? I'm just going to go, it depends, we'll get it out there, right? For the most part, lift and shift is something that if you are moving VM workloads, it's fine, right? But if you've got an application and you move your VMs into the cloud, what you're going to find is your cloud billing is going to consume the budget that you'd hoped to use for app modernization. And we were talking about this before we started, right? I think all three of us are agreed that the reason there's an it depends in there is because what is the workload? What is the business value? What is the cost going to be? You need to do more of an examination of what it is you're moving before you just do that simple lift and shift choice.
Yeah, and it might be part of your cloud migration strategy, right? Where you say, okay, we have this on-premises data center and we want to move out of it, but we have a strict deadline because otherwise it's another 3 years of capital expense and paying for the data center. That might be a reason to move it as an intermediate step and just lift and shift, and then hopefully, not the cost doesn't go sky high, but it does get you out of your data center first, and then you can have some more time to breathe and think and do it the right way for the rest of it.
Yeah, I can add to that. Of course, the cost thing that Rick mentioned is fantastic, and the same goes when you're scaling as well, right? So you don't want to blow your budget on doing things unnecessarily. If you set your parameters for scaling wrong, you're going to spend way too much money and blow your budgets. Equally, the kind of idea of lift and shift and it depends, very true, because there's so many factors that can affect it, and especially for a running application. Let's say modern web application would have a database and some other things, and they'll probably all have their own services, and you maybe don't want to move all of that in one hit. Some of it may stay on premise for data protection reasons or whatever you need to do, but yeah, it really, really does depend.
So well, we can make it sound so easy with the lift and shift, but what is your approach if applications were not designed for the cloud? Moving them to Azure, what's your approach to that?
I think you need to understand the application first, right? Really understand exactly what each component is for, does its needs. Does that need to have completely bulletproof uptime and can never have any latency or anything? Or is it okay for a service to maybe be offline for an hour or two because you've got a queue that will take all the requests and you can process them later. So yeah, understanding the application I think is really important. Understanding the dimensions and the resources that each component of that application needs, I think is equally important too. You want to make sure it's sized right the first time you migrate. And then, what's the goal with the cloud? Are you moving from VMs to PaaS or to Kubernetes or something? Or are you going to just do a lift and shift?
Yeah, and there's other lift and shift, right? Where you just take your application code, put it in the cloud, and then say, okay, I had a regular SQL server, I will now make it an Azure SQL something. That's one approach, but we found that deeply integrating into cloud and respecting the way cloud works does require, another approach maybe, and decomposing your application, understanding it well, seeing what parts are there and which approach fits best with which part of the application. So Microsoft has this 5R analysis, right, where they do rehosting, re-architecting, replacing, 5 Rs. And you can do it as a whole for the entire application, but you can also do a functional decomposition and then see what's best for that area.
Or which, yeah.
So that's another way of moving more into cloud native.
Yeah. Interestingly, I was just going to say a similar thing in a different way, right? Everybody goes, we're going to move to the cloud. And most of my time is spent saying, why?
Yeah, exactly.
You've got an application, you think you want to move it to the cloud. Well, the first question is that application still giving you value? Is it still relevant? Can we buy a replacement as a SaaS service and not have to manage it at all? And I think too many organizations don't stop to look around at what their choices are before they rush headlong into moving it into the cloud. And the second thing that they do is they don't, to Callum's point, they don't learn about the application before somebody comes in and tries to re-architect it. Every time you hire new developers, they go, well, I wouldn't have built it that way, and I'd like to look at how we've designed this, and I think we ought to be using these services. It might be.
Sounds very familiar.
There's a lot of stuff in there that's really valid, but if you don't know much about how the application works, who's using it, what data's moving around, then you can't answer any of the questions. Things we were talking a second ago about, right? Where do you put the data? Is there something legal that might affect that? That introspection that can take several months to do the review is the critical first step.
Quite a process. So let's say, for example, I would now approach you and I want to move all my company's data to Azure. What would be the approach? What's the timeline? What's the process?
It depends. Eyebrows like, yeah.
Well,
how would the whole process look like?
Well, I think that the data is a thing that you need to look at again, right? Because if you do cloud and things turn out they're more distributed in nature and more isolated, such as microservice approach or something, then you have data that is spread out across your landscape, and you can think about how you deal with that, but that's usually data that is updated regularly, and there's the reporting and the insight side of it, and then you need to harvest all your data again. So your data architecture becomes something new in the cloud as well, and you need to think about, okay, how do we get this operational data into this insights pool of data, like an Azure data lake storage, for example, and work from there, and how do you process it? And there's beautiful reference architectures out there that can help you get some insights there. But the playing field changes when you move to cloud. You can't just do what you did, but then think you can project that onto the cloud as is. You need to take it to the 3.0 level and skip the 2.0, because that's usually doing what you did in a slightly different way. But you need to rethink it completely and then re-architect your entire setup.
Something I was going to add to that is whenever we do a migration, in addition to that sort of understanding the needs of the application and the customer, you want to avoid nowadays, organizations still do this unfortunately, but you want to avoid that big bang migration. So quite often we will choose to migrate either compute or data or even simple things like logging. If a lot of our applications may be logging stuff to a disk or to a service running on a server, and we'll try and swap that out with App Insights. And it's just trying to move slowly, component by component, and we'll come up with a plan, like a roadmap for doing that. It could be that the compute can move very easily, the data for legal reasons can't move so easily, or because it's being updated so often. That's really tricky. So a phased approach generally, no big bang migrations. Hopefully.
I feel like my answer should be I agree with Callum, right? So I spent an hour talking to people this morning about how you need to learn about your application and learn about your data. I think telemetry is a really big one because a lot of organizations have an application. Telemetry doesn't exist. It's new to them, but it's important to get that learning introspection. And then they start re-architecting the app, and then you end up breaking your data down almost. Traditionally on-prem, we've got a whacking great SQL DB. Well, resilience is difficult with a SQL DB in Azure. We might want to pick a service like Cosmos, which is easier to scale and easier to be geo-distributed. But that means we've got to rethink how we handle our data. And if we're moving to microservices, well, if we're doing microservices properly, that means we're splitting the data up and holding the data closest to the thing that's going to use it, right? So I don't think you can do that quickly. And most of the customers that I work with actually, I talk about having anchors that naturally stay in place while you do the work around them, and data tends to be that anchor. And the most obvious reason is we cannot move it out of the UK, right? Because I'm a UK consultant. But the next one becomes, well, we need to split it apart and move it out, and then you suddenly find you're doing an integration project to support a migration project. And you've got to start with that assessment of what you've got and what can go where and what should go where.
And during such a sort of like due diligence of what is there, right, and what should be moved, what shouldn't be moved, I don't know. Yeah. Have you ever encountered like little microservices or whatever that people didn't even know they were still supporting, or it was still like driving something? Yes. Yeah. Oh, why
all
not?
three. Yeah.
It feels like yes all the time.
The people that did the traditional IT said, no, this is everything we have, and then it's, oh no, we found out, and we actually had this recently last week. We had a customer that said, oh, apparently we have an Active Directory somewhere in a closet running there, and we didn't know that Azure AD connect into the cloud, but it was there, and we thought it was gone, but it was still there.
Yeah.
So that happens, yes.
Okay, so they pull the plug on something, and then
there's always some in the world of VMs. There's always some Windows service or something running on a VM somewhere that turns out to be incredibly critical, and you don't know until it's been turned off. Some batch scheduled job that people are still doing that, scheduling things with the scheduler in Windows, and people turn the VM off, and then panic ensues. So. Yeah, it's scary, the kind of things
Panic is never good.
That's fun, though. I mean, sorry for those companies, but I feel like those are the fun stories. Sorry, I was wondering if there's any common misconceptions. I mean, you mentioned costs before. Like I hear all the time, cloud is so expensive. Is that true? Is there other misconceptions that you want to address and rectify? Maybe, who knows?
The cloud will not save you money. Probably.
Yeah.
It depends. Part of my talk earlier, we compared 3 options for hosting and scaling an app on Azure, and they were app service, Kubernetes service, and container apps. And the big difference between the 3 of them is cost, strikingly. App service overwhelmingly costs more than anything else. And it's not cheap. Certainly not cheap. You could go to a very, very cheap hosting provider out there if you just want a bare metal server, dedicated server, and host it for a few dollars a month, really. And in Azure, that's going to cost you hundreds of dollars a month, for sure. However, Kubernetes service is really interesting. It can save you a whole ton of money if you utilize it properly. So if you're going to, say, spin up a cluster with 5 nodes in it, and you're going to utilize 80 or 90% of each of those nodes, you will save significant money because VMs are cheap. If you only utilize a small percentage, you're paying for so much compute that you don't need. And that's where platforms like container apps, which is effectively serverless, and you're just paying for what you're using, consumption, there's no dedicated resource there, are fantastic. So the whole, the age-old question of will we save money by moving to the cloud? No. And I know, Rick, you had some thoughts on like efficiency as well, didn't you?
Rick is dying to say something.
So, look, it's not that cloud is cheaper or more expensive. So if you think you're moving to the cloud to save money, you are wrong. it should be about being pulled to the cloud, right? Cloud is about capability. So Callum's point was a really excellent one. App services is not necessarily cheap. I'm paying for that instance. But I can make that instance as small as I need to, and then it can be really elastic and scale out and scale in. There are things that I can do in the cloud that I cannot do on premises. The reason cloud migrations fail, back to where we started, right, is we go, we're just going to move 500 VMs and leave them as 500 VMs. There is no additional capability, there is no leveraging the things that the cloud can do that nothing else can do. And those projects are the ones that fail. The app modernization projects and the born in the cloud projects where people take a look at the smorgasbord of what the cloud has, right? There are so many different Lego bricks. Just pick the right brick for the right purpose and you'll get a beautiful model of a house. If you pick the wrong brick and use it for the wrong purpose, it's just not going to work, right? So it's walk into it, don't run into it, and take a look around and do a lot of prep. The projects I always see fail just fundamentally rush into the cloud because they think it's going to be cheaper.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would add to that the misconceptions, right? That the goal is to go to the cloud, and we think it's not a goal per se, it's an enabler. And it ties into your way of working as well, because the cloud allows you to do full automation, which is an enabler to do DevOps the right way. I know there were wonderful talks today on what a DevOps mindset is and what it entails and what you need to have for that. And the cloud enables you to do so. So I think that a misconception, we need to move to the cloud because. No, it's just an enabler. But for the things you want to be more agile, a high-performing organization with DevOps teams that are autonomous and have full responsibility, you need that. Need that cloud for it. And the other misconception I would add is that companies say we can't move into the cloud because we need to be secure and compliant, and this is public cloud, so can do. But I would say the cloud can be made very secure and compliant by default by using policies and other things. And taking really good care of your security concerns, allowing even banks, insurance companies that are highly regulated and audited to move successfully to the cloud. And I believe you had some things on that.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. We've done projects where there are certain parts of it that can't be put in the cloud, literally can't because of the data. But at that point, cloud is also an operating model, right? So hybrid cloud allows you to do all of the great development and work as a team, how you are going to deploy to the cloud, but you're actually deploying to on-prem. So you're using things like in the Microsoft world, it's Azure Stack HCI, it's Azure Stack Hub. And a lot of people just go, oh, it's public cloud, therefore we can't. Rather than, this bit of information can go here and it needs to stay, let's stick to the UK as an example, right? This has got to go in the UK because. Actually, this bit can go in Europe because, and this bit absolutely has to stay on our data center. And then it's simply a matter of leveraging all the skills that we've had as IT pros and developers for years, right? And making sure that the wet string is secure and the connectivity is secure and the auditing is done and the security is reported on so we can see what's happening. People tend to be too dismissive in either direction. You know, oh, it's really easy, we'll put it in the cloud. Oh, we shouldn't have done. Or we'll never go to the cloud. And you go, really, why? You know,
it's not an all or nothing thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Completely agree. Completely agree. There's nothing to disagree with there. The security on the security point that Rick mentioned as well. It's an organizational mindset, I often think, security. So I described it earlier as kind of active versus passive security. I feel like the kinds of organizations that want to lock things away behind in a cabinet in their office are the more passive types of organizations, whilst going full cloud and embracing that and handling security as a active and reactive thing, monitoring with proper alerting and stuff. Obviously, you want to have regular pen tests and those sorts of things as well on your infrastructure, but those should be there to give confidence in the work that you're already doing. Whereas I think those older school organizations, it's a lot more rigid. Someone's guarding it somewhere, aren't they?
Well, so we are on Azure Lowlands today. Of course, we're talking about Azure. Your sessions were about Azure, as well as our panels about Azure. What are your thoughts on a multi-cloud strategy?
Ooh.
I'm going to let someone else start, and maybe I can finish.
Wow.
An option, a choice.
But not preferable.
No, well, that depends on what you're trying
depends.
to achieve. Yeah, mostly it depends, because some companies don't want to have a vendor lock-in, but in the end, there's always some part where you are connected to something specific, and there's things like Terraform that give the impression that you can be agnostic and all, but in reality you're not, because it's still designed and dedicated for a particular cloud provider. So I think the trade-off that you would be willing to make, are you really going to use it? And are you willing to give up the deeper integration that I mentioned, getting everything from homogeneous, is that the word, environment such as Azure, where everything is nicely connected together and you get more by moving the parts together, versus doing a best of breed approach? Is possible, but it doesn't necessarily give you the best soccer team if you put the best players together. Sometimes you need to have things that work well together.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you need to keep in mind.
Nice analogy, by the way.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as a consultant, I talk to a lot of customers who say to me, we don't want vendor lock-in, Rick, we want multi-cloud. And I go, do you really? Because if you don't want vendor lock-in and you want multi-cloud, well, now we're at VMs, or possibly Kubernetes, but I'm running my own cluster. So there's no value. All of the benefit of moving to the cloud has gone. And then, if we can set that one aside, they look at their internal dev teams. And dev teams have skill sets, right? If you're a Microsoft shop that's been running on Windows Server and building on .NET, let's face it, the easiest migration is going to be Azure.
Yeah.
Yes, Azure's an open cloud, but if you're using alternative technology stacks, it might be that there are other clouds that are an easier migration. You need to take that into consideration, because your team are your greatest asset and they're really difficult to replace. But to Alex's point, what I tend to find multi-cloud comes in as is best of breed. So I've got a current customer where their internal application is actually running on AWS, because the dev team knew the technology, they built it on that. But the data team did a careful analysis and they picked Azure. So the big data analysis tools that they're using, they're running in Azure. And it wouldn't surprise me if they looked and said, well, now we need this capability, and pick GCP. They do a very careful analysis. And exactly as Alex said, they then look at that and say, well, how hard is it to integrate? What are the barriers? Back to, do we have all the right regions in all the right places to interoperate with this stuff? So I spend an awful lot of time dispelling the multi-cloud myth for vendor lock-in, because an organization that's determined to do that, you're just like, you may as well stop, because it's not going to say, back to our original point, right? It's not going to be cheaper, but it's also not going to give you more capability. But picking the best service for your business needs, that's an easy choice. And Callum, you said you wanted to finish this one. So.
Exactly, and the best of breed argument, I think, hands down, that's the right approach. But best of breed at a maybe not at such a granular level. You could almost do it at a kind of a tier level, almost, to say that our compute is on Azure, but we use another service for data because that is better, and that's okay. And there's a lot more trends now about these kind of codeless solutions as well, and then it really does mean that it doesn't matter so much about where your infrastructure is, but you are going to have a vendor lock-in at some point. And the reason I wanted to finish on this is something that people often try a lot, very hard to do, is we're going to have some compute on AWS, some on Azure, that's fine, and they're going to split the services, and they may have different regions responsible for different things, and that's perfectly okay. But I think it's almost impossible to completely eradicate failure points. And the example I was going to bring up was the Cloudflare thing last week, where Cloudflare, people kind of see it as impartial, almost. It's not one of the big five cloud vendors, and people have no problem of just putting Cloudflare in front of their site. And then when Cloudflare goes down and takes half the internet with it, you've got a really big problem. And then you have to rethink your strategy. And I don't think multi-vendor DNS really is a thing at all. It's always going to be DNS. DNS
It's
is
always
always
DNS.
going to be the failure point at
It's
some point.
always
So
DNS.
I don't think it's possible to do a
All
true
right.
multi-cloud
Yeah.
approach.
Thank you so much for your answers. Unfortunately, our time went way too fast because I feel we can all keep going, talking, of course, about this. Thank you very much for being here, being with us today. Hope you have a great rest of the show, and thanks.
Thanks for having us.